Arm Holding IPO is promising to be one of the biggest in 2023 with a purported valuation of $60 billion to $70 billion. SoftBank acquired 25% stake from Vision Fund with a valuation of $64 billion. So that's what Masayoshi Son is hoping to get from this IPO at least. But why such a massive valuation? Is it worth investing in Arm IPO? So these are the questions that I'm hoping to tackle in this video. But first, let's start understanding what Arm Holding is doing for a living. Modern-day chips must have a certain set of instructions in order for them to execute certain commands. Well, what do I mean by that? So let's break it down. So for instance, if you're typing something in Microsoft Word, like a letter or phrase, the computer must first recognize what you're doing, what the buttons you're pressing. Then it must take what you're pressing and translate that into a certain symbol, then store it on your memory, on your computer, and later show it on your display. So what it's doing, all these operations that are happening behind the scenes, it's what these instructions that the computer must have in order to execute all these steps one by one in sequential or parallel order. So this is what exactly ARM is coming into play. It is actually designing this set of instructions for the chip to execute and to know what's happening when the user is interacting with a phone or laptop. These instructions are also referred as instruction set architecture. I'll just refer to it as architecture. There are currently three major players in instruction set architecture. Intel is one of them with its x86 architecture. It has been around since 1978 and it's the oldest one. ARM is also one of the largest instruction set architecture providers. risc-v is another competitor of ARM and Intel. It's a relative newcomer in 2015. It's still being built, but at some point it may pose a threat or competition to both ARM and Intel. If we looked at x86 architecture and chips designed with it, unfortunately they are not exactly low cost. They're also power hungry and they generate a lot of heat. Unlike this, ARM architecture does not generate much heat. It's low cost and is not power hungry. For this reason, it's perfect for handheld devices such as phones, tablets, laptops, and many others like drones, for instance. Note what ARM is not doing. It's not building actual chips. It only provides instructions for executing commands on those chips. So that's a very important distinction. If we looked at the balance sheet for ARM, we can see that it's a very heavily R&D company and it's a very light asset company. Its main asset is human resources. And actually, if we look at its cash flow and balance sheet, we see that there are really not much property or plant or equipment, and there are very little capital expenditures on cash flows. But at the same time, we see massive R&D costs on the income statement, which amounts to over 40% of ARM revenues. You can think of R&D for ARM as a capital expenditure in a sense. There are over 250 billion chips shipped today that use ARM architecture. That's a cumulative number. And notice on this graph how this number started growing exponentially since around 2010. That's when the smartphones took over the world. Also, many other big tech companies such as Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, they all use CPUs in their servers that use ARM architecture. Moreover, Apple transitioned its chips from Intel to ARM architecture since 2020. That was a very big deal for Intel, for instance. They lost a pretty big customer for themselves. Also, if you look at that ARM and its market share in smartphone CPUs, it's basically a monopoly. I mean, it's 99% of all phone CPUs are using ARM's architecture. That's a very big deal. If you remember, maybe in 2012, Intel had to back off from developing its own smartphone CPU chips because they were too costly or they just weren't working, so they abandoned their effort. And that's a big deal because it says that ARM has a very big competitive advantage as far as smartphone devices CPUs. Also, if you look at the income statement for ARM, it's very profitable. It generates most of its revenues from royalty and license payments from its customers. They typically amount from 1 to 2% of the value of the chip that's being developed and sold. So that's how actually ARM earns its income. Over 50% of ARM's revenues are actually coming from smartphones and other consumer electronic devices. That's a big risk because these devices and sales tend to be very cyclical. And so right now maybe we're in a down cycle. People do not buy as many phones as happens recently. Okay, let's continue looking at the financials for ARM. So we see that ARM revenues grew by about 7% for the past 8 years on average. That's a compounded annual growth rate. At the same time, while the revenues grew, its actually profits stagnated. Operating profits declined more recently. Or even if we do not consider this last year as an example, it was still not really showing much growth for the past 8 years. And that's a big red flag. A lot of it is due to a large R&D spend that ARM is taking on. A lot of cash is going out of the door for salaries for engineers, scientists, and that's a big problem. If you look at the figure that ARM actually showed in its IPO, we see that the cost of design for more and more advanced chip architecture is growing. It's actually growing exponentially. And the gist of this graph is that the smaller the chip, the more expensive it costs for ARM to develop products. And that's a big red flag because we are getting really to the tiny chips in modern days. If there's anything you can remember from this video, it's this, that the cost of developing these chips growing, and they're growing faster perhaps than even the revenues that the ARM is generating. ARM has no debt. If we assume that the valuation for the IPO is going to be $65 billion, we can construct relative valuation metrics and compare them to, say, Nvidia. A quick comparison to Nvidia, we see that ARM is actually valued on par with Nvidia, but it has much less impressive growth rates for revenues or operating income. Even if past is not a good predictor of future, we still see that ARM is too richly valued compared to Nvidia. Recently, Nvidia unveiled Grace Hopper, which is a platform to handle massive AI workloads, and they said that they will use a CPU based on ARM chip design. Based on this, you may get an impression that ARM is positioning itself at the center of AI trend. But is it really so? To answer this question, let's take a look at Nvidia supercomputer, very popular to handle massive AI workloads. According to SemiAnalysis, the cost is close to $270,000. But what's important is to look at the cost breakdown for each component. Looking at it, we see that over 70% of the cost goes towards GPUs and associated baseboards, and that's exactly where Nvidia is earning their big bucks. But what about the CPU that potentially can use ARM architecture? It's really not that big of a deal. It accounts for less than 10% of the total value. Even if we assume that chips developed by ARM used in these massive platforms for AI, they are used somewhere else, it's still like 10 to maybe 20% of the total value. It's not really that big of a deal. And the reason for this is this. CPUs are not really good at training AI machine learning algorithms. They're good at inference after it was trained, but not at training, because they're not really good at handling parallel tasks compared to GPUs, which are excellent for that. Okay, so moving on to the next thing, and this is a big red flag for me. ARM has a big exposure to China, with about 25% of its sales. If we look at further, we see that the subsidiary that it's called ARM China, ARM is actually have no control over it. There were problems in the past. They were trying to oust the CEO and it took them over 2 years. So there were some conflicts in the past. Moreover, there are these strange passages referring to problems in the past. Basically, it says that the amount of royalties ARM earns from China depends on financial information provided by who? ARM China. But wait, didn't we just learn that ARM does not control ARM China and there were conflicts in the past? This is definitely a big red flag. Finally, there are signs that risc-v, which is another alternative architecture to chip design, is gaining traction. It's an open source architecture that I mentioned before, and they were started in 2015. And I think it may gain traction especially in China and maybe Europe as well. The reasons are very simple. China is very determined to shed its exposure and dependence on the West in terms of semiconductor equipment, chips making, so they will try their hard to develop alternatives to ARM and not to be dependent so much on the West. So looking at the big picture, the question becomes, is it really worth buying into ARM IPO? If we look at the big picture, we see that the AI trend is strengthening in investor minds. But ARM is not really benefiting from this trend. doesn't have anything to show in terms of operating growth, or even revenues are not as big as you would expect from, let's say, comparison to Nvidia. Moreover, R&D devours a very large chunk of its operating profits, and it's only growing and will be growing in the future most likely. So do not get me wrong, Arm is a terrific company, but is it really worth paying that price, assuming that there is a 60 to 70 billion valuation for the IPO? I would say that the max valuation that I would be willing to consider is close to 30 to 40 billion dollars. If you think about it, Nvidia tried to purchase Arm a few years ago, and they were paying max of $40 billion for Arm. But now, for no reason, it's worth 60 or maybe $70 billion. It's not final yet, but still maybe that's what is expected. And I don't know what has changed since then. I mean, maybe the hype around AI kind of hyped up everyone in their minds that maybe it's worth paying an extra for Arm, or maybe not. I don't know, but I definitely know, as Buffett used to say, is that it's far better to buy a wonderful company at a fair price than a fair company at a wonderful price. Again, so this entire video is just my opinion and opinion only. So please do your own diligence and keep your money safe. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. I will have more videos about investing in the future. And also check out my blog that I linked below for more details about Arm IPO. Thank you for watching.